Hello and welcome to the Sunday Special. We're joined this week by Andrew Yang, author of the book, The War on Normal People. I can't wait to get to my conversation with Andrew. Let's start with this. What prompted you to run for president? Where are you coming from? What's your backstory for folks who don't know you?
So I certainly was not one of these kids who grew up thinking they were going to run for president. I was born in upstate New York. My parents are immigrants from Taiwan. They met in graduate school at UC Berkeley. So my father was an engineer for GE and IBM. He generated 69 US patents over his career. And being an academic was sort of the family business. My dad's a professor now. My brother's a professor. My grandfather was a professor. So I, like you, went to law school. I went to, I studied economics and political science in college, didn't know what to do, so I went to law school, and then practiced law for 5 unhappy months, and then left to start an ill-fated .com in the first bubble. But then I'd been bitten by the bug and said, this is much better than being an unhappy lawyer. And so I worked at a healthcare software company, and then I became the head of an education company that grew to become #1 in the US and was acquired by a public company in 2009. So at this point, my career was going really well, but it was the wake of the financial crisis. And I thought that we had all of these whiz kids heading to Wall Street and McKinsey, and not enough starting generative businesses in places like Detroit or Cleveland or Baltimore or St. Louis. So I quit my job. I started an organization called Venture for America that helped create several thousand jobs in those cities and another dozen cities or so around the US. And the reason I'm running for president is that when you spend time in the Midwest and the South, you see the aftermath of the fact that we automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Missouri, Iowa, all the swing states that Trump needed to win and did win. And so I'm running for president to wake up America to the fact that it is not immigrants that are causing economic problems. It is the fact that we're going through the greatest economic and technological transformation in the history of the country. It's called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and we need to progress to the next stage of capitalism in order for our country to prosper in an age where artificial intelligence and self-driving cars and trucks will become real.
Now, you talk a lot in the book, The War on Normal People, about these people who are in the middle of the country and whose talents are sort of being left behind, their jobs are sort of being left behind. Do you think that the Democratic Party has properly spoken to a lot of those people? There's a feeling that President Trump won specifically because the Democratic Party largely forgot about those folks.
Well, to me, there's a very powerful central economic narrative where if you look at the voting district data, there's literally a straight line up between the adoption of industrial automation in an area and the movement towards Donald Trump. And so to me, Democrats need to try and address that set of problems. And if they fail in that, then they're not trying to solve the problems that got Donald Trump elected. Like, Donald Trump is not himself, he's to me a manifestation of this greater economic mega trend. And it's up to the Democratic Party, in my opinion, to help America navigate this wave as opposed to focusing too much on Donald Trump, who to me is a symptom.
What about the argument that the economy seems to be doing pretty well, that every time there's a technological change historically, there's been worker displacement, that there will be people left behind because that's just the nature of creative destruction, but that new jobs will be created in ways that we can't foresee right now? What makes you think that this time is sort of the cataclysm?
Well, we will 100% create many, many new jobs that we can't predict. And the issue is that they're going to be for different people in different places with different skills than the people that are going to lose their jobs are going to be able to take advantage of. And so if you look at a couple of big historical references, number one, the Industrial Revolution, which people generally refer to and say, hey, we've been through this before. The Industrial Revolution at the turn of the century included mass riots that killed dozens of Americans and caused billions of dollars worth of damage. We now have Labor Day as a national holiday because of those riots. We implemented universal high school in 1911 in part as a response to these problems. And Bain and McKinsey project that this time is going to be 3 to 4 times faster and larger than that Industrial Revolution in terms of displacement of workers. So even if you just rely upon history, you would expect a lot of violence and tumult and conflict. Number two, I studied economics in college, and according to economic theory, if you were to automate away 4 million manufacturing jobs, which we did, those workers would move, get retrained, reskilled, find new, higher productivity jobs, and all would be well. But when I dug into the numbers, it turns out that almost half of those workers left the workforce and never worked again. And of that group, about half filed for disability. And then you saw a surge in substance abuse and drug overdoses and suicides, none of which were in my economics textbook. It didn't say, hey, like workers are going to go home, file for disability, and start dying at record levels. So if you look at that fact pattern, you say, okay, that's what happened when 4 million manufacturing workers lost their jobs. That's actually a much better sign of what's going to happen when the 3.5 million truckers and the 2.5 million call center workers and the over 10 million retail workers suffer from the same sort of displacement.
Two completely oppositional ideas that many people seem to hold simultaneously. First, work is vital and the core of human experience. Second, no one will want to work if they don't have to. Well, where do you stand on that? Do you think that work is vital and people are going to work, or do you think that work is not vital and that this hole can sort of be filled by the government paying for it? So I assume that you believe work is vital. I mean, you talk a lot about it in the book, and you're opposing that to the idea that people won't work if they don't have to, but you're acknowledging a lot of people aren't going to work, right? I mean, your basic government proposals involve a lot of paying people whether they're working or not, obviously.
With the goal that we create more work, because I'm very much in the work is vital camp, and that's not just my thinking about it, that's just in the data. Where if you look at what happens to idle men in particular, we spend a lot of time on the computer playing video games and doing other things. We volunteer less than employed men, even though we have more time. Our drinking and substance abuse tends to go up. And over time, there are some antisocial patterns that develop in idle men to a higher degree than women. And so that's just data. And so if you look at that and you say, okay, this actually is pretty consistent with my intuition that work is incredibly important and vital. It provides structure, purpose, fulfillment, meaning, social structures to people every day. And so the question is, how do we create more things like that? Now, to me, the best path to create that is to put economic resources into people's hands in the form of a freedom dividend of $1,000 a month, which would then allow more people to do the sort of work that either they want to do or that their community has a need for. And the goal is to create jobs, and putting $1,000 a month into people's hands would create at least 2 million new jobs, just because the buying power would just go right back into local businesses and communities. Now, all that being said, I do think our definition, our notion of work should evolve. And one example I use is my wife is at home, and we're talking about our families. My wife is at home with our 2 young boys, one of whom is autistic. And right now, she works very hard. I mean, she works harder than I do. I'm running for president, and she's working harder. But the market values her work at zero. Society, in some ways, minimizes the value of that work. And so, to me, we should broaden the definitions of work to include being a parent or caregiver, but also arts, creativity, entrepreneurship, journalism, things that we know people, coaching, volunteering, civic engagement, things that we know people want to do more of, but that right now society will systematically either undervalue or not have any monetary value.
With all of that, so what makes you think that the freedom dividend is going to have a different effect on human behavior than, for example, current government welfare systems have?
Yes. So 3 things. The first is that money does not somehow convey meaning. The best it can do is maybe provide circumstances that help people find a path towards some work that they find fulfilling. The second thing is that I have a friend whose sister is on disability, and she's afraid to volunteer in her community because she's afraid she'd be noticed as able-bodied and thus lose her benefits. And so this freedom dividend would be unconditional and free and clear, and so that person would be volunteering and would not have any fear that her benefits are going to be taken away. The third thing is that there's something very, very important about conceiving of yourself as either able or disabled. And so if you're literally getting a check for being disabled, your 2 ideas of yourself are, 1, I'm genuinely disabled, and most people do have some kind of genuine ailment, physical or mental, or 2, I'm defrauding our society and I'm actually totally fine. And I'm going to suggest that most people will fall into bucket number 1, that it's like a rare person who's just like, I'm 100% fine, and this disability check I'm getting is just me being completely fabricating some condition. And so if you invert that mentality and you say, hey, you are not disabled, you are fine, you are a citizen of the richest, most advanced country in the history of the world, and you're getting this cash and it's going to be yours no matter what because it's yours and you deserve it. then that would be more constructive in terms of pushing more people into things that they'd feel good about, that society would feel good about, than if we say, hey, there's something wrong with you and we're going to give you this cash in order to survive.
Where's the logical limit on that, and how do we limit that from just eating the rest of government? Because entitlement programs obviously are running us ragged now. They obviously represent 2/3 of the federal budget. Adding another massive entitlement program on top that doesn't have a limiting principle, how do we limit that so it doesn't become the overarching goal of government and actually put too much of a press on the capitalist system?
Yes. So the first thing is I would disagree with the characterization of a dividend as an entitlement program. And there's one state that's had a dividend for 37 years, and that state is Alaska, which is deep red. It was passed by a Republican governor. And he said, look, who'd you rather get the money? The government who's just going to screw it up, or you, the Alaskan people? And the Alaskan said, us. And he said, I thought you'd say that. and then now everyone in Alaska gets between $1,000 and $2,000 a year, no questions asked. It's created thousands of jobs, it's improved children's health and nutrition. It's decreased income inequality. And here's the kicker. It's wildly popular in a deep red state that hates taxes, because they see it's like, this is one of the few things the government gets right. Like, I actually get this dividend. It's great. I look forward to it. It's real. I can spend it. My kids get it. Like, life is better as a result. And so, like, it's different from an entitlement in both its structure and the way it's utilized. So that's big picture number one. Number two is, right now you're right about the fact that our entitlement programs are creeping ever higher in terms of both proportion of the federal budget and the enrollments, where there are right now more Americans on disability than work in construction, as one example. And these trends are not going to abate, they're actually going to accelerate. So the question is whether we're going to try and restructure those programs to something that we can all embrace and get excited about, that will actually help keep American families and communities strong, instead of waiting for more and more people to get debilitated by, for example, an automation wave that's going to displace the significant proportion of the people that hold the most common jobs in the economy, which we're in the midst of right now. And so the question is, do you wait and say, okay, like, I guess we're going to have more and more people qualifying for these welfare programs that have very negative incentives attached to them? Or are we going to own the reality and say, look, we get it. We're going to have this dividend, and then we're going to reverse the incentives of those programs over time. Now, to your question about like whether there's a logical limit, the reason why $1,000 a month is so magical is that it's enough to make a huge difference in the lives of individuals and families. It's going to help children's health and graduation rates and mental health, and kids will have a real chance to learn. Will reduce domestic violence, will reduce hospital visits. But it's not enough to be a labor replacement, because $12,000 is below the US poverty line of $12,700. And so people are still going to have to work to prosper and have a life that anyone's going to be excited about. So my goal would be to put in this $1,000 dividend and then keep it at that level.
Let's talk about your view of capitalism, because I think that there's something interesting there. So you talk about what you call human capitalism, the idea of changing our notion of capitalism, where essentially it changes how we see the market. You say human capitalism would have a few core tenets. One, humanity is more important than money. Two, the unit of an economy is each person, not each dollar. And three, markets exist to serve our common goals and values. Well, on sort of an abstract, in a vacuum, I agree with a lot of that stuff, obviously. I mean, I have kids, I have parents, right? Humans matter more than money. And if you asked me to sell my child, obviously the answer is no. I like my kids, so although it depends on the day. If you're asking, the units of an economy, dollars versus people, there I start to have a little more trouble just on the economic level, because what I'm actually paying for is a skill set, not a person. Obviously, the value of each human being is infinite, but the value of each human being's labor is certainly not. You can't say that the markets exist to serve our common goals any more than you say that free speech exists to serve our common goals. Free speech is just a recognition that I, as an individual human being, have worth. And so free markets are the same thing. It's a recognition that I, as an individual human being, my labor has worth. So the idea that the market is just something that is an institution that we have come up with together and then we play with, I'm not sure that's an accurate description of what markets actually represent. There's an underlying value to human labor that is not just a common system we all decided to come up with one day. It's just a recognition that I can alienate my labor and you can buy my labor. Is that wrong?
Well, so to me, the fundamental shift that we have to start getting our arms around is that certain people's labor is not going to be worth enough for them to make the kind of living that is required for them to live what they would consider a good life. And so if you look at look at truck drivers as an example, because I use them because they're the most clear. So you have 3.5 million truckers making about $46,000 a year. And that it's a punishing job. They're behind the wheel of this truck for up to 14 hours a day, and they're away from their families 4 days a week, and the rest of it. But their market value, with the market of their time behind the wheel, it's about $46,000 a year. Now, if 5 to 10 years from now, my friends in Silicon Valley come up with trucks that can largely drive themselves, and then you're going to go to that truck driver and say, hey, turns out your market value, like your time behind the wheel, it's not 46,000 anymore. It's 26. It's 0. It's like whatever the number is. And so there's like a change building up in our economy, that the freedom to trade your labor for money to make a good living for yourself, that's actually going to end up breaking down in more and more situations where that truck driver is no less willing to trade his time. I mean, he still wants to do it. But then the freight company is going to be like, turns out your time's not worth what it was. And it's not just the trucker. It could be a radiologist who makes hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they interpret radiation films, say, I'm very willing to do this. Like, I like getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then we say, hey, turns out that AI can see tumors you can't, can refer to millions of films, not thousands, can see shades of gray that are invisible to the human eye. You lose. Like your time all of a sudden goes from worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to, let's call it, like half that or 0 or whatever the number is. And so I think that it worked for a long time when the average American could show up and say, if I'm willing to work hard and I've got a strong back, I can make a decent living for myself and my family. Like it was in the 70s, where if I showed up even to a manufacturing plant, I may be able to provide a middle class life for myself and my family. But then if that stops working, then we need to start thinking differently about how the labor market functions.
So if we've moved beyond sort of the concept of free markets as places where we can alienate labor because some people are not capable of alienating their labor is just not worth anything, then is the idea that the collective owns the labor of everybody and gets to redistribute the products of that labor? Is that what we're talking about here? Because it gets into dicey territory.
No, and I agree with that. And that's actually the outcome we have to avoid, if at all possible. And this is one reason why my flagship proposal is we give every American $1,000 a month free and clear, and that doesn't somehow usurp your labor, your time. That actually, if anything, liberates your labor, your time. That if you have a little bit more freedom from scarcity, then you can start making moves towards the sort of work that you want for yourself, that you value, that you would find fulfilling and exciting.
Let's talk about the cost side of this. So you proposed value-added tax. You point out that in Europe there is value-added tax, which is essentially a consumption tax. You want to add that on top of the income tax and the business tax as opposed to replacing it. If we were talking about replacing it, I'm on board with you, man. I'm totally for a VAT replacing whatever income tax system we have right now. Where do you think the breaking point is as far as how much the system can support in terms of taxation? Right now, we're living pretty heavily on debt, obviously, and adding a bunch of new costs in the form of UBI or quashing economic growth to a certain extent, because as you increase the tax rate, at a certain point, you're going to hit a breaking point. Where do you think the ideal tax rate lies? You're setting the taxes. How does the ideal tax system work?
Well, I agree with you that ideally we are not taxing labor in the same way we do now, because you don't want to tax things you need more of. And in my opinion, we need as much work and work-like arrangement as possible. And so ideally, you would find ways to tax things that are not labor arrangements. And so when you say like, hey, if you like swap out, certain income taxes for like a consumption tax, you're on board. That to me should be the long-term vision. The question is how you get from here to there. And so the way I would start is by implementing this value-added tax at half the European level. Is quite modest, but it would help capture some of the gains that Amazon and these other mega tech companies are experiencing and return those gains to the American people. And some of it will float back up to Jeff and Amazon again, because you'll just buy an extra toaster. But like a lot of it will go to your local restaurants and the mechanic and the tutoring service and the hardware store, and it'll help replenish the Main Street economy and create jobs. But there is, to me, like a movement in that direction that we need to get to. Because right now we're just taxing, in my opinion, or we're taxing highly inefficiently. And you look around, and the way that we're trying to address this is like, hey, it's like there's like this high marginal tax rate. I try to explain to people all the time, look, Jeff Bezos is worth $160 billion. And most of that is Amazon stock. and it went from zero to being worth $160 billion, and he's way too smart to have a taxable event. Like, I can ratchet up the marginal tax rate very, very high, and it's not going to help anything.
On UBI, final question, which is, how much can money actually do? I wrote an entire book, which right now is doing very well, The Right Side of History, in which I talk about, I think, the lack of meaning and purpose in people's lives. And I wonder whether signing a check is going to actually alleviate that in any real way. It seems like there's been a loss of social capital and social fabric that can't necessarily be filled with a government program, and that no matter what government program we propose, if that social capital is not restored through certain basic beliefs in fundamental principles of the country, certain freedoms and certain beliefs in community and the kind of charitable organization that you are the head of, that it's going to be very difficult for people to find meaning even if they're making a little more money, because the fact is we're the wealthiest country in the history of the world. People are exorbitantly wealthy. The poorest among us, I mean, the rich would have been clamoring in 1880, or for that matter, in 1920, to live like the poorest among us live now. So can we fill what is effectively a spiritual hole with a government program?
This is, to me, the generational challenge that we're facing, is how do you create more community ties and structure and purpose and fulfillment and paths forward for Americans who feel this central void in their lives? And of course, like $1,000 a month does not fill that void. But, and here's to me the path forward, is if you take a town in Missouri with 50,000 adults, and they're struggling with that sense of purpose, and then you say, hey, good news, now there's another $50 million in your community every month. So what happens to that money? Some of it goes into local businesses. There's a person there who wanted to start a bakery, and the bakery was a dumb idea, but now the bakery's a good idea. And then he starts it, and then he hires a couple of people, and then people like his baked goods, and then some of that money goes into religious institutions. Some of that money goes into nonprofits. Some of that money goes into arts organizations and cultural organizations. And then you end up giving people an opportunity to at least start to address that new sense of structure and purpose and fulfillment and meaning by making it so that everyone feels like they have some value, they're not going to die, like that, like their kids have a future, and then putting at least the beginning of some resources into their hands to try and rebuild. And maybe for some of them, it's like, hey, now I'm going to leave this town. Like that could be the way like I'm going to rebuild. But that to me is the generational challenge. How do you restore that sense of self-worth and social capital and the rest of it? So it's not like money does that, but what money does do is that money helps create the conditions where we can at least start to try and address that central challenge.
I want to ask you about your perspective on healthcare. So you talk in your book, The War on Normal People, you talk about what you would do with the healthcare system, and you recommend a single-payer healthcare system. Obviously, I'm a massive opponent of a single-payer healthcare system. That is acknowledging the problems with our employment-based healthcare system. That's something I think both of us agree on. Now, I'd prefer a system where people are effectively paying for their own healthcare so that they can actually see the cost of what it is that they are consuming. And then we can form coalitions, as we do, and associations to help defray the cost for people who have pre-existing conditions and all the rest. You recommend a single-payer healthcare system. Why do you think that's the best option?
Well, I think you and I might have had similar experiences where if you run a small company, you see that our current employment-based system is a real weight on the economy, where it makes it harder to hire people. It makes it harder to treat someone as a full-time employee because you have these incentives to treat them as a contractor. It makes it harder to start a business. It makes it harder to change jobs. It's like this massive source of friction. And so the question is, how do you separate healthcare from your employment situation? Because right now, you can imagine how many more entrepreneurs there'd be in the US if they didn't have to stress out about healthcare for themselves and their families. I mean, there'd be many, many more people starting businesses. Now, I agree with you that there has to be some kind of skin in the game. Like, it can't be that if you just show up, it's like always cost-free, because there are some people that are hypochondriacs and like consume a lot of treatment. So there should be some sort of individual skin in the game. That said, I feel that healthcare is an environment where the market is going to be an imperfect solution, because one, you get very cost insensitive if you have a serious illness or your loved one is seriously ill. Two, it's like the pricing is very confusing and opaque, and then you're relying upon specialists for various pieces of information to say, oh, you need this, you don't need that. And so it's not like the same sort of market as many other consumer goods or experiences where you can trust that you're going to say hey, I'm educated on what that product means for me. So I think that we need to try and get the costs down. And right now, we're living in the worst of all worlds, where we're spending twice as much on our healthcare as other societies to worse results. And it's a massive impediment to our economy and hiring and dynamism. So I just think that having a robust public option, you can improve the access, bring down the costs, just because we're saddled with this incredibly inefficient system right now.
And you talk in the book about this idea that we're going to have to shift how doctors think of doing their jobs. And you sort of suggest that doctors are going to have to become more altruistic. That instead of seeing this profession as a way of making money, they're going to have to see it as just, you'll make some money, but you won't make enormous money. The fact is that you're not going to get people to go through a 10 to 12 year system of education if you're telling them on the other end they're going to get paid like postal workers.
Well, certainly not postal workers, but
even $150,000 a year. I mean, the fact is that, thank God, I've been able to pay for my wife's education this whole way. But if we had not, then she was working below minimum wage in her residency,
yes.
Because she's working hours and hours and hours, and even if that's $50,000 a year, she's working legitimately 80 to 90 hours a week. And then she has, most of her colleagues have hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical school debt,
yes.
And they're going to have to pay all of that off. It seems to me that if we have a supply and demand problem, we need to increase the supply of doctors, and the way to do that is to actually incentivize people to join the medical profession, not by telling them that they need to be paid less in the name of altruism, but they need to be paid more through transparency and pricing and being able to decide their own standards.
Well, have you seen why our supply of doctors is constrained?
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, people don't want to deal with the administration. They don't want to deal with the insurance companies.
It's because the doctors and the medical. So one, it's incredibly
medical
expensive.
licensing as well. Yes.
Yes, it's incredibly expensive to educate a doctor, and the supply has been constrained for years, even as many communities have become what's called primary care deserts. Because when someone, and this is one reason why I'm congratulating your wife on being a family medicine doctor, is that when she's in training, she's racking up all this debt. And then she's like, wait a minute, if I specialize in certain things, I'll get paid a lot more than if I become a primary care doctor. And if I live someplace where they can, afford to pay me more, then I'll live better than if I go to some rural community or small town or something where maybe they don't have a doctor like me, maybe they could really use a doctor like me, but my life's going to be harder, I'm going to get paid less, et cetera. So right now, to me, you are 100% right that we need to increase the supply. But it's not a compensation issue. We just need to increase the supply because right now the doctors and the medical schools have not created new paths to train doctors. And that's been a problem for years and decades.
Well, it's certainly true that we have to deregulate a lot of medical licensing. So you're a libertarian on that one too. I mean, it sounds like, having nurse practitioners being able to do more things would be a very good thing.
Yes, particularly when we get really good AI. And this is something the doctors have fought. Is that if you were to say to a doctor, or the doctor's lobbying group, I should say, it's like, hey, there's a primary care desert. Like, we need to send someone over there and they need to be able to treat patients. Doctors have been like, no, needs to be an MD.
Right.
And then you're like, but wait, there's no MD there. Literally, and none of you wants to move there. And so we need to make it so that nurse practitioners can do more. And this is particularly true when we're going to have AI that can at least help diagnose a significant proportion of conditions and recommend treatment. And then you can always refer to a doctor if it's helpful.
I mean, we agree on all this, but I think the question is, when it comes to Medicare for All, the truth is that fewer people are going into the medical profession. They're choosing to be lawyers. They're choosing to be businessmen, specifically because they don't want to deal with the hassle of the government. There are lots of doctors increasingly who won't even take Medicare. They'd rather take private insurance because the Medicare and reimbursement rates are 60%. And you are mandated to get through a certain number of patients, in many cases, if you're working at one of these hospitals, to do a shift.
So right now there's a double whammy going on. And so what you're suggesting is like, hey, it's because of low reimbursement rates, which is certainly an issue. But the other issue that's attendant, which is at least as important, is just the amount of bureaucracy and paperwork and administration. And like these doctors, I'm friends with, because I'm Asian, I have a lot of doctor friends, where they say it's like, I'd love to just actually be seeing a patient, but instead for every 10 minutes I spend with a patient, like I'm spending, or one of my staffers is spending, 4 minutes on like documentation or administration or billing.
Well, a lot of that has to do with medical liability.
Yes.
A lot of that has to do as well with regulation of these insurance companies and lack of transparency, because the truth is, if you walk into a doctor's office right now and you ask a doctor how much an x-ray costs, they have no idea. They have to submit it to the insurance company.
Yes.
A lot of this seems like regulatory problems to me, not necessarily to be cured by the collective bargaining of Medicare.
Well, we've created this incredibly Byzantine labyrinth. And so the question is, how do you clean it up? And how do you free up doctors to actually focus on patients and care rather than billing codes and paperwork? And that is the path that we have to take. Now, there are different, like people can have different approaches, but that is, to me, where we need to try and go.
I totally agree. Talk about the Green New Deal. So you say you're aligned and on board with the Green New Deal. Which part of it? I assume not the part for unable and unwilling to work and killing the farting cows.
I'm for the fact that climate change is a growing threat, where the last 4 years have been the 4 warmest years in recorded human history, and that our projections about what's going to happen, unfortunately, are getting steadily worse. And so the question is there something that we can do about it? And this is a space where the government, to me, has to play a key role, because the financial incentives right now are towards forms of energy that are just more developed and more economically advantageous at this point. So if someone says, hey, we need to move dramatically in a direction towards renewable energy, like I applaud that vision, because I think that is where we need to go. The way I disagree with some other people on this is that we sometimes pretend that the United States is somehow 100% of global emissions. We're about 15%. And so even if we were to go whole hog, we would probably diminish the rate incrementally. And so I'm for trying to address and mitigate the worst effects of a warming planet, with the recognition that it's probably going to happen whether we move towards renewable sources of energy or not.
So this is hilarious, because you and I are on exactly the same page on this. Also, you've endorsed nuclear power, for example, where many of your colleagues have, I don't even know how it's possible to say that you want to reduce global warming, but you're also against nuclear power. That just seems completely mad to me.
Yeah. I mean, nuclear has to be a big part of the solution if you're going to head in this direction.
Well, thank you so much for stopping by. It really means a lot. I think this is a great discussion. I'm sure that our listeners are going to have a lot of thoughts in response. If people want to give to your campaign, they can check you out at yang2020.com?
Yes, yang2020.com, or just Google Andrew Yang. But would certainly love to have everyone's help and support in this campaign, as we're going to make history together. We're going to bring the revolution of reason to the American people. It's not left or right, it's forward.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Andrew. Thanks for stopping by.
Thank you, Ben. It's been a pleasure.